Hello and welcome to the second of these webinars on marketing the library. My name is Chris from Creative Concern, and my colleague Faith is here for Creative Concern as well. And we're delighted to be part of this. Thank you. Lovely to see so many people. And basically we're looking at kind of creative concepts and creative ideas and how that you can all be a part of that and help to generate new creative ideas. So there's going to be plenty of time for questions, but we are going to do a presentation as well. So by all means, write down your questions. We'll kind of just go through it in one session, if that's all right, and then there is going to be lots and lots of time for discussion. So that's kind of where really interesting stuff comes out. So very keen to answer as many questions as we can get through, really. But thank you to Libraries Connected for asking us to do this. Yeah, let's give it a whirl. I'm going to try the screen share. We had a slight hiccup earlier, so I'm hoping it's all going to be all right this time. So hang on a sec. Okay. Can I just check that that is sharing okay?
It is.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay, so we're from Creative Concern and we're going to talk about creative ideas and campaign ideas. And in terms of us as an agency, we really believe that creative communications can make a big difference. So our client base really is in the charitable, not-for-profit space and the public sector. So we do work with a few other clients, but really that's our real focus. And we've been doing that for a long, long time now, nearly up to our 20th anniversary. We're an agency based in Manchester, but work all over the UK and all over Europe and elsewhere as well. And in terms of our services, just so I think it's important, this not in terms of what services we deliver actually, but in terms of when we're thinking about creativity and campaigns, it can be any medium really. So it can be digital, it can be advertising, it could be about creative copywriting and messaging, it could be about PR and social media, film, animation, design and branding. It is really, really broad. And I think that's the important thing here. When we talk about the techniques that we're using here today, they can be applied to anything. It's not that we gearing it towards one particular kind of format or output. And in terms of here at Creative Concern, we have a way of looking at creativity. I just want to sort of share with you really sort of three kind of key things. But before I do that, I think the other thing about it is that creativity actually matters, as in it can help you achieve more. So it's not about being creative for the sake of it. It's actually about being creative because it can help you achieve your goals. So whether that's a fundraising goal, whether it's about building up awareness, whether it's about encouraging people to take a particular action or respond to something or sign up for something. This isn't about just coming up with ideas just because it's fun, although it is fun and we want it to be fun and want to share some of that with you, because I think the good thing about this is it should be an enjoyable exercise. It's also about having a greater impact, have a greater influence, and that's kind of why it's worth doing. So our first of our rules for you today is that everyone is creative and can contribute amazing ideas. It's not about who can draw well or who has got kind of design, aesthetic, or got design skills. It's about the core thing about ideas. And I firmly believe that all of us as human beings have got great ideas to share and can contribute and be part of that. So really, what this webinar is not geared towards necessarily communications professionals. If you are a communications and marketing professional, that's great. But actually, it's about the whole team. It's about everyone working on the same goal and same mission and contributing ideas. And I think that's when the really good stuff happens. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is your best idea is probably the next one, the one you're going to have to try a bit harder to come up with. We often start with, Faith will talk you through, a kind of ideas sprint or ideas generation process. And what you tend to find is the obvious ideas come out quite quickly. People have been thinking about it before they come to the session, or be thinking about it when they've been laying in bed or on the train or whatever. And those ideas come straight out. But actually often the more interesting ones, the more powerful, impactful ones come later, because actually once you hear from other people and bounce ideas around, that's when they bubble up and come out. So we're all about kind of encouraging you to stretch yourself, think a bit harder, and that's often where the good stuff happens. And the third thing is it's about collaboration. I think I was talking to Faith earlier this morning about this, that actually one of the best things I think in terms of working on creative ideas is that actually by the end of it, you can't really remember whose idea it was. And that's kind of the point. It's not about my idea. and getting my point across. It's about collaboration and sharing, and that actually once you piggyback off each other or bounce around ideas between people, you kind of build on each other's idea, and that's when really good stuff happens. And I think, you know, obviously we have all been working more remotely recently, but these techniques and the things we're going to talk to you about work equally well in a digital space, in a place where we may not all be in the same room together. Being in the same room together, it has definitely got its merits, and that's important too, but we've had to adapt and change to how we deliver these sessions for our clients and for the projects we work on, to make sure that they work in a collaborative space. And sometimes we've worked on ideas with clients that we've never ever met because they're abroad, or, you know, they're just in a part of the world we're not going to go to. But it doesn't mean that you can't collaborate in a really interesting way on ideas. So, but before we talk you through one of our main core techniques, I think it's really important to learn from others. And what I mean for that is that if you're working on a particular project, then have a look at what else other people have done, because it's just the easiest, quickest way to kind of really get the cogs in your brain going and start to think about ideas in a new way, but also just to kind of assess the landscape in terms of what others have done. So a little bit of research, and we're not talking about masses and masses. You're talking about possibly, if you could spend an hour doing this, then it will make a massive difference in terms of coming up with better ideas yourselves and really understanding the kind of the marketing effort that you need to put in. So there's lots of inspiration out there already. The great thing about, one of the many things brilliant about the internet is the availability of visual material and ideas that people distribute and share for free. So it's fantastic. So spending 1 hour doesn't have to be online, because I know sometimes it's good to get out there in the real world as well, but online is not a bad place to kind of start to look at what other people have done. So if it's about libraries, then look at what people have done, not necessarily in your area, so your local area. Look at what the people have done in the best places in the world. I always think that, you know, whatever project you're working on, you should aim high and aim to try and do better than them. So, you know, we might be working on a project for a little town in the northwest, but we might still look at what people are doing in some of the biggest and most vibrant cities in the world are doing to try and inform that. So looking for inspiration from sources doesn't necessarily mean to think, well, I need to find a library service of a similar scale to me in a similar town to me. Look around at the very best, and it will really kind of enrich that the ideas that you come up with. So there's all sorts of places to look at. One place that I think is quite a quick reference is there's a list of the 70 best blogs and platforms for creative inspiration in 2021, which seems pretty relevant. And so if you search 70 best blogs 2021, creative blogs 2021, you'll find it. The link is there. But it's a really good source. It's all kinds of different things. Some of it's around kind of photography, some of it's around campaign ideas, some of it's just really interesting visual things that people have put together. It's a really good list. It's a good way to kind of think, oh, actually, yeah, we could do this a bit differently. So I recommend having a look at that. I've just got a few slides now. Really, it would probably make slightly more sense later on, because I'm going to talk to you about a particular campaign that we've just very recently worked on. Actually, I think it launches next week, so it's very pertinent. But this was just some of the mood boards, we call it, of ideas that we found other people had done on the same topic. So it's about this, the campaign we're talking about is about mental health. It's about encouraging people to talk more about mental health issues. And so, you know, what we started to do is to try and gather some information. So we tried to broaden our horizons about it. So we're looking at some myth busting, so what mental health is, what it isn't, what other people have done to try and visualize some of that world. Looking at some really great campaigns, what other people have done to try and understand, well, how other people have tackled this particular topic, what can we learn from them? And we just sort of gather that together, and that can be really rough and ready, you know, taking screen grabs from the internet. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as you can gather it and potentially share it with your colleagues. And so this is from Headspace, really big brand now. But yeah, looking at different approaches to it. So some of them are very graphical, some of them are quite soft. And so we want to gather that in so that we could really have like a mood board of what different people had explored when they're looking at the mental health challenge, so that we could learn from the best and be inspired by them. And, you know, it's not about kind of copying, but there might be something that you see and you think, actually, we could do something like that, just with our own twist on it, in our own way. But actually, by looking at what others are doing, it can really help stimulate that. So, we found some great stuff, and later on I'll share what we came up with for this particular campaign. So it's really about, before you start, think about what you're trying to achieve, and then have a little look round at what others have done just to inform that process. So that's a little intro. I'm going to hand over now to Faith, and she's going to talk us through a particular technique that we've developed and use at Creative Concern that can be used by anybody.
Thank you, Chris, and hello everybody. It's lovely to be with you this morning and to talk you through this. As Chris mentioned, we have a number of different activities and techniques that we use almost daily in the agency and with our clients. We call it Creative Lab because it is a kind of ideas generation thing, and we're going to share some of those ideas and activities that you can use with you this morning. Even if one or two of them are helpful to take into your teams and take into your daily work, you might find that they make a difference to how you interact with your colleagues when you're trying to come up with new ideas and the quality of the ideas that you do come up with. Next slide, please, Chris. So Creative Labs is pretty straightforward in its definition. It's a method of generating lots of good creative ideas or concepts to meet a brief in a really short space of time. And it is really just as simple as that. But it's important, there's some important parts of that really, which I'll unpack a little bit more shortly. First of all, it's about lots of ideas, and that is actually a really important part of this process. It's really easy to settle in on one idea or a couple of thoughts and get a little bit fixated. But the most creative work and the most creative thinking comes when you really try and expand out and you go for volume initially before you then to start to filter down and make some selections. So this set of approaches that we're going to share with you will hopefully help you get to loads and loads of ideas, some of which will be half-baked, some of which will be totally inappropriate, but all of them will have a role to play in leading you up to a point where you think, yeah, that could be it, that's going to work, we've got the idea that actually is the refined one for us. And also it's about working quite quickly. We know that people's time is tight and that you don't have days and days to kind of dedicate to this. So we usually run these as a workshop session, as Chris said, virtually. I did exactly this yesterday with a client, and we ran it over an hour and a half, all on Zoom, or in a room together. So we've done lots of it face-to-face and virtually, and they can work both ways. That's just kind of repeating really what we've just said. We use it because even as creative professionals ourselves, we need to have some footholds really when we're approaching new briefs and new projects to get our creative thinking started. Creativity is not something that just comes automatically, even to people who have that word in their job title. And it's certainly not something that just pops out of the air. We have to actually work on it, and kind of it's working through some tools and techniques and processes to unlock that thinking, especially when we've got busy jobs and busy lives. We also do this to make it fun, because what we found as comms professionals, and I'm sure you'll probably find as well, that if it stops being fun, nobody gets anything of good quality out of it. So we really try and make sure that everybody's enjoying the creative process, because ultimately that leads to a much better outcome. So we do have some rules of the game, and they're listed out here. We always share these when we're working on a workshop. We always share these at the beginning because it's important that everybody kind of understands the rules. So you work with the information that you have first and foremost. It's dead easy to get hung up on things that you don't know and allow those unknowns to derail creative thinking sessions. So sometimes it can be that how a campaign is going to roll out hasn't been completely defined yet. Sometimes it can be that the budget hasn't completely been signed off, or we're not totally sure that we'll have access to something, or that something will be able to come off. As soon as you're starting to get into the unknowns, it can easily start to derail thinking, and everyone can get quite stuck. So what we say is that we try and bring as much information to the session as we can beforehand, and then we work with what we've got. We always brief the participants of any kind of creative session beforehand, so people aren't coming in cold and don't feel shocked. We usually put a bit of a written brief together. People have the chance to read stuff and understand it beforehand, and come up with some ideas, because there's a challenge right at the beginning for them to do that. But we don't let all that information kind of get dragged into the main creative session. We ask people to prep beforehand. Work quick and don't cling to one idea. Exactly as I've just said, it's good to get as many ideas down as possible. Volume's the key at the beginning of a lot of creative processes. So make sure if you're running the session, you're keeping people going. You don't let people go on too long about a particular idea. Everybody has a favourite idea that they're really excited about, and it's good to capture, and then you've got to move people on from it. Capture all ideas as well. This is really important, and it's an important part of making sure that everyone feels valued and involved in the process as well. As Chris said, we very often with clients try and encourage them when we're running creative sessions to bring more than just the communications or marketing team around the table. We ask people to bring, we ask our clients to bring representatives from teams that are on the ground, kind of customer facing, service delivery and so on, and everybody's place around that table is just as valued. But there's no question that sometimes that can be quite an intimidating space for someone to be in if marketing isn't their day-to-day job, or if that's not something that they're used to doing. So you have to make sure that everybody's ideas are captured equally, and that no one feels like they've got to step back or allow the marketing people in the room to take the lead, or that their idea perhaps isn't as valued as someone else's. Capture it down, because they all do have potential. Every idea will have something in it, and can even feed another idea and spin off in a positive way. And then think freely, try not to be too constrained by brand or budgets. We know you will all be working under brands, and of course there's budget restrictions, but in the early stages when you're trying to come up with some creative ideas and be a bit more free thinking, don't let those elements be too loud in the mix of the conversation, because they can constrain your thinking. There's just a couple of other rules that aren't on the slide here, but are kind of important when we're working with teams to generate creative ideas. One is, as Chris said, that this doesn't always have to be face-to-face, that this can work as well remotely as it can in a workshop setting. But also, these activities don't all have to run as a single session. So we have run ideas, kind of creative labs. We've run idea sessions that have spun over 2 or 3 days and used different platforms to do that. And that actually has quite a lot of value in it. It gives people the chance to come do an intensive bit of thinking for maybe 20 minutes, input on a survey, or the next day it is a Zoom call, or the day after that we do a quick text thing. It gives people the chance to do something intensive, step away, because the stepping away from thinking about the idea sometimes can be as fruitful as the sitting around the table and trying to get the ideas captured. So remote works just as well, and when you're in a remote space you've got more flexibility to mix it up, use different platforms and ways and approaches, and spread it out over a longer period of time. The other thing that is a rule for me that I try and remember is, don't let the most senior person around the table lead the session. And if you have a marketing or comms person in there, think about them taking a little bit of a step back. Maybe don't let them lead the session as well. The reason that we try not to let the most senior person lead, and the activities that we're going to talk you through are so structured, it's easy to pass on to somebody else to chair or lead the activities. It's not too overwhelming. It's just simply so that everyone feels like they're on a level playing field, and it allows ideas to come through without that sense of somebody else should really be saying that, or that maybe somebody's better placed to have that thought or idea. So just a couple of extra things that, from my experience of running these sessions, can help when you're trying to get everybody working as a team. Okie dokie. So here we dive into some of the activities. As I say, some of these may be useful to you, some of them may not be. So hopefully there's going to be 1 or 2 at least here that you'd want to take away and trial with your own teams and in your own organisations. Warm-up exercises. So here's an example of a warm-up exercise that we use, and it feels, and in some ways is, totally random. So this one is a kind of, think of a new flag for a newly discovered island. We get people usually with a very tight time limit. We normally set a timer of maybe 3 or 4 minutes to draw a flag and write down 3 interesting things about this new island. We do this partly as an icebreaker if people aren't familiar with other people on the session and so on, but also it is an important, serves an important purpose, because when you take people out of the actual brief and away from the organisation and give them something completely random and seemingly unrelated to do, again, it levels everything. Nobody knows more than anybody else about this brain stretcher. Nobody has any more insight or any more ability to do this than anyone else. So it just sets everybody else off on the right foot, and it makes sure everyone feels like they're at a level at the very start, and that's helpful. It is also quite good to break people out of their usual mode of working. Lots of us are just typing away all day and have a very particular way of working. So we try and come up with brain stretchers or kind of icebreakers that are about drawing physically with a pencil or a pen or something, and physically writing as well. Get people doing something that just jolts them out of the way that they usually would be working, hopefully away from their emails, and gets them going and gets them a bit ready and warmed up, really. This is the next activity that we do. I love this because I think it can be really, really valuable at the beginning of a creative workshop or process or what have you. And to be honest, I do this on my own sometimes. I've done this for years. I picked the idea of this up from another workshop actually years ago, from another creative presentation, and it's super helpful. So even if you're on your own, you can do this to help you get real clarity about what it is that you're trying to achieve. As I mentioned before creative sessions, or when we're just trying to get everybody up to speed, we will send out often quite extensive written briefs that have come in from clients or come in from elsewhere. There'll be lots and lots of detail in that brief, and at one level, all of that information is really valuable. It's really important. So people are familiar with that. But that volume of briefing information sometimes can feel quite oppressive, and it can feel like you're just trying to remember all that information. It doesn't leave a lot of room for creative thinking. So we do the brief basher early doors when we're getting creative. The first thing that we usually ask people to do is cut it down to one short paragraph. So we give them a time limit again, and we get people to say, okay, you've got a 4-page, 5-page brief here. That's brilliant. Say it in 5 lines. What are the 5 lines that really encapsulate the brief? That in itself is a real challenge, but then we tend to then go on to say, okay, it has to be 1 line. What is the 1 line that encapsulates the essence of your brief? I've been mean in past workshops, and we've then gone down to 3 words sometimes when people are kind of up for it, and it's a challenging but lovely way to approach the brief. The reason that works so well alongside people's knowledge of the wider brief, of course, is because it actually gets to the essence of what you're trying to do. The briefs very often contain lots of secondary objectives and additional thoughts and partners that need to be considered and things that it needs to link into. But to help fuel your creative thinking, it's helpful to have the absolute essence. What are the 4 or 5 or 6 words that nail what it is that you're trying to achieve? If you can get that, sometimes it can kind of springboard you into a more creative space when you're coming up with ideas. Oh, Chris. This is often we do these activities sequentially. So often the next activity that we'll be working through with clients and internally when we're doing it with our colleagues is what we call think, feel and do. This is a lovely exercise as well because it actually connects you out to your audiences and the people that you're trying to reach. So doing this is another kind of foundation for those ideas that you're going to be coming up with is really useful. It's dead simple as well. It's not rocket science. We ask people to answer these 3 questions. We'll usually sketch them up on the screen or sketch them up on boards or ask people to contribute them virtually if that's how we're doing it. First of all, we're asking people, what do you want people to think when they encounter this piece of communications or this campaign or this brand or event or whatever it is? What is it that you need them to remember and recall and think when they see that? Often we'll say, well, like, what are the 2 top actions or the 2 top things that you need them to remember and think about? Again, that's a lovely way of really streamlining it down. Then we ask what it is that you want people to feel. And that's really valuable when you're trying to be creative and come up with ideas as well, because this is about the emotion that you want to evoke. And comms and branding and campaigns can evoke wildly different emotions when they're still conveying the same practical information. So actually defining at this point, do you want people to feel really uplifted, joyful, optimistic? really feeling like with this, you know, teaming up with you on this, they can do anything. It feels really, really fantastic. Or do you want people to feel a sense of urgency, or this is a real panic or a need, or a bit kind of anxious about it? Like, if we don't act now, this is going to be a real problem. What emotion is it that you want to evoke when people see the material that you've produced? What is it that you want them to feel? And then most importantly as well, although sometimes this can get forgotten and lost, is what is it that you want people to do? Having a really clear call to action is pretty vital. And we do sometimes see comms that we're helping clients to develop and what have you, and they have lots of information on there, and they have lots of context and so on, and tips and written materials and so on. But they don't actually end it with any action. It's just a kind of, and we've told you, and that's it. But many times audiences that you're reaching out to want to know what you want them to do after that point. You've told them something, you've got them excited, or you've got them engaged. What is the action that they need to take? So nailing that helps you make sure that whatever it is that you're producing has a real purpose. And then we go into the first round of ideas. So when I'm starting off these sessions, and when I'm preparing people before they come to these creative sessions, I'll warn them that we're going to be asking people to come with ideas. This is really important because I usually set the challenge of 3 ideas. Everybody has to come to the table and they have to give 3 ideas. Those ideas get written down, every single one. As we said, that's one of the rules. Everything gets logged, and nobody gets to hide, and nobody gets to avoid it or shirk away from this one. It can be a bit intimidating, and that's why we really emphasize the kind of points around the fact that they can be a bit crazy or ill-formed, or it can just be a line or a slogan or a picture that you have in your head. Anything goes in terms of this. This doesn't have to be kind of oven ready, but people have to come with some ideas. It means that they are contributing straight away, and you straight away start to build up a volume of ideas that once you actually lay out on a screen or a piece of paper, you can start to see some themes and some trends and some strength coming through in those ideas initially. Then what we do is we ask the team that we're working with to rise to the challenge of doubling the number of ideas there. So that's done through conversation and open conversation, and kind of encouraging people to read back through the ideas that have been had and come up with extras. They can be springboarded off an idea that's already written down, something that's kind of a development or an evolution, or it can be something that's just popped into someone's head when you've been going through the earlier activities. But we say try to double the ideas that you have as a team. Again, this is about volume. It's so that people have the volume of ideas, and it also loosens it up a little bit. It means that people are talking and can start to feel less ownership over their ideas, and start to just think about the ideas that are generated as a team, which is nice because when you actually get down to the refining stages, there's no kind of precious feelings about ideas. It's just the team's generation. So the next few slides are where we go into like the 3rd round of ideas generation, but we give ourselves and our clients, when we're doing it, a little bit of lift on this. We give them a few tips and a bit of an aid, because usually by this point people are flagging a little bit and they need something else. So when we run this face-to-face, we have decks of cards, physical cards, and every card has a prompt on it. So these 5 here are examples of some of those prompts that are on our workshop cards. When we moved to delivering these predominantly virtually, we got all those prompts and got them up on our website. So Chris, can you just flick onto the next slide? This link here, this web page actually on our website, is where we go through everything that we're talking about today, and you'll find some of those resources. And then at the bottom of the page, if you go to the next slide, Chris, you'll see that at the bottom of that page, there's like a little auto generator. So if you click the new thing, please, it brings up at the bottom below that another prompt, another creative prompt. So normally, and when I was running this yesterday with the charity that I was doing the session with, we had 5 prompts. We hit that button 5 or 6 times and got 5 prompts served up to us. they were super, super helpful. We were really lucky. Sometimes the prompts are a bit random and odd, and there is no problem with ditching them if they don't work. So if something lands and people can't connect to it, you move on to the next one. But yesterday when I was doing this, we had things like, how can you make this humorous, which you can see on the slide there. If children were putting this together, what would they say? How would children put this idea together? We had a prompt around scale. Can you play with scale? We had a prompt as well about how would a scientist build this campaign? How can you make it facts and figures and stats? So there's tons and tons of different prompts on there. They will just be a starting point for you. It's nice to actually start to generate your own and think of your own kind of prompts that always work for you to try and jog out a few extra ideas. And again, what's lovely about those prompts is that they usually do lead on to an additional idea or two that's captured, and people feel again less precious or like they own those ideas because they've come from somewhere else. So quite often those are the ideas that come through in a more collaborative way as well. We'll share this link afterwards, but do go on if you want to check out some of these slides are on there, and as I say, the little prompt generators at the bottom of that page too. So have a break and a biscuit, which everybody does tend to need, especially if they've been doing these sessions on Zoom. We all know now that, you know, your attention spans on screen run workshops and so on are a little bit less than even face-to-face. So we do try and build in a break, but these are also really critical. And for yourself, no matter how you're trying to spark some creativity, it is really important to step away. I mentioned this earlier on, when we run these processes over a number of days, we don't run them as a traditional workshop. Sometimes the most fantastic stuff comes out of that because people have stepped away, and when they were making their tea or making another call or thinking about something else, something's popped into their head. So we do this to give people a natural breather, of course, but we do also build in breaks because those are the times when the ideas sometimes can come through, and the best ideas sometimes are had when you've stepped away for 5 minutes or for the rest of the day or what have you. So we then do come back together and discuss and select a minimum of 3 and a maximum of five ideas. For us ourselves, what that means then is that we take those forward to the next stage of creative development. And that usually for us means that our copywriters and our designers will take those ideas and they'll start to play with them a little bit. The next step is usually some roughed up ideas. And I'm going to show you what they can look like in a minute, actually, because I'll take you through a case study where I show you the rough ideas before we get to the final idea. But that might not necessarily need to be the case for you. You might want to capture some of those ideas and step away and on your own work out whether the campaign plan might work in that way, or, you know, have a little bit of time to do a bit of development and check that it is actually going to work in practice. Between 3 and 5 for us tends to be a workable number. If you go for less, very often when you get into that point of trying to test it and work it up, you'll lose an idea or two. Something that seemed golden in the room sometimes just can't be executed. It can't be made into reality. And so you need enough so that you can comfortably lose a couple of ideas. If you're taking too many in, you've not done a good enough job of like streamlining those down and trying to make them as kind of refined as possible. Help with doing that is a check back on the brief. And this is another reason why I love doing that one-liner kind of icebreaker at the beginning, because you do need to at some point take those ideas back and check that you've not lost your way, and having that sense of what the essence is of what we're trying to achieve here helps to do that. There's obviously going to be, as the refinement goes on, checks against the more practical elements of the brief, and again that's usually where you'll lose an idea or two because it just isn't practical, it doesn't work. But referring back to that one-liner that you've developed and just making sure that you've not lost your way in terms of the essence of what you're trying to achieve is really helpful. And there we go. Now you've got a short list of ideas, hopefully, that people will feel that they've collaborated on and that you've got some shared ownership over, and hopefully feel like there's real potential in them. The process of working them up can be a little bit brutal, and you do have to be prepared to lose those ideas. But the beauty of working creatively in a collaborative way is that you don't feel like you're chopping somebody's idea out. You don't feel like it's a personal personal slight, because all these activities are designed to make the group feel like they're generating those ideas rather than it coming from an individual. So you should be able to refine back and lose what's not working and so on a little bit more easily and without that worry of offending anybody. So testing and refining. This isn't always an option to everybody, but we really advocate for some ways to test your ideas with the actual people that you're trying to reach. As I say, that can be super comprehensive and expensive and involve focus groups and all the rest of it. And we do lots of that. That's certainly true, but that's not always achievable for lots of our clients and lots of the jobs that we work on, and possibly for yourselves as well. So at the very least, try and get some of your ideas in front of other people who are not in those creative sessions. If you have newsletters or any kind of mailing list at all. We've had clients in the past who've used those mailing lists to share out ideas on surveys and get thoughts and ideas on what might work. Or if you have kind of warm service users, people that you know come in as groups or that you could have direct conversations with, test out some of the ideas that you have, and at the very least share it with some colleagues, some additional colleagues, to see if there's anything that they can spot that you've missed, and that just you get some external perspective on the ideas that you've been developing. Okie dokie. So that was quite a whistle stop through some of the activities, and we'll be more than happy to go back through those or add in as we get into the discussion phase. But what we wanted to do was dive straight into the examples, because the examples help bring to life some of those creative processes and might help you kind of just feel a little bit more inspired and motivated by it. So I'm going to talk you through the first one, and then Chris is going to pick up to finish us off. And the first example that we're going to share with you today is a charity, Bart's Charity. So any of you who are London based might have heard of Bart's Charity. It's the charitable organisation that supports Bart's Health NHS Trust. It's a big charity in London, very ambitious, and had a couple of years ago a real ambition to increase their public profile and their public fundraising. So we got involved. They wanted to do a campaign. They wanted to have a presence around the hospital sites, but they knew they wanted it to be more than just their brand. They wanted a campaign feel. They wanted something creative and that would speak to hospital patients and families directly and could really support the fundraising ask that they were introducing into the hospital. So we ran a Creative Labs. We went through exactly the process that I've just talked with you, and that helped us generate loads of different ideas. And what you're seeing on the screen here are the rough ideas that were worked up off the back of that Creative Lab. So as you can see, they're not very refined. They're not super well worked. The typefaces are just typefaces that we've picked, and some of the images, well, all the images are just stock images. So they're put together with enough to explain the concept, but without being overworked. And there was lots of different ideas that came through on that session. Everything from kind of illustrative type to photography led, and some kind of campaign lines as well. So this set of visuals and others alongside them went into some testing. Here are some additional ones that we took through, and we tested these with some of the charity supporters and their staff as well. So we ran some groups, some discussion groups, and put them on the table. One of the reasons that we don't work them up too much, they still have a little bit of a rough feel to them. That's intentional, that's deliberate. It's partly so we don't spend all the client's budget on things that are never going to see the light of day, but it's also so that when we're testing, and so that when we're taking people through the ideas, they don't feel that they're so refined that they can't pick it apart. And we're always at pains to say, if you hate this, pull it apart, tell us. It won't waste loads of time and money, it's fine. And that's really important, because then you get genuine feedback. When we went through the testing and talking to the client and presenting them to them, we found there was no one idea actually from our Creative Labs that flew. We had loads of ideas that we were really excited about from that Creative Labs session. It was a really fruitful one, and we thought, God, there's some ideas here that are definitely going to be goers. But actually, when we talked to the client through them, there was no one that they loved. However, they did love some elements of all of them. So they loved the bold colours. They loved the bold and powerful colours of the option that you can see there on the right. They liked the graphic kind of approach as well. They started to talk about the B, but could that be, you know, text? Can we make more of the text? They liked that. They loved the portraiture. They thought the portraits of the staff were good. They just didn't like the way it was in this. They didn't like the idea of life changes. They couldn't connect to that. But they said, you know, we love the idea of those people looking out at us. That feels really good. And they liked the idea of real quotes as well, although they didn't like the way it was executed and what they were saying. But we took several pointers from that, and the next slide shows you what the end result was. So this is where the campaign actually landed and how it launched a couple of years ago now for Bart's charity. So you can see some of those elements that came from that very original creative session: the bold, bright colours, the type, the portrait photography, which we ended up commissioning for them, and the quotes as well. All of those were pulled through from those early ideas that we had, but then we kind of reinvented it. We kind of took all those bits and we put them on paper and we worked out what was working and what wasn't. And you can see how it rolls out. We rolled this out across all the hospital sites across Bart's Trust. We obviously big vinyls like that. These people who participated, I think, are super brave, because this is their place of work and they are up at like 10-foot sizes on the walls of the wards that they're in. I think that's a huge commitment, but they all loved it. And it also translated into things like donation points and so on, that people could then go and tap to donate and support. So that's a kind of quick example really of how you can run a really fruitful creative session, have loads of ideas, and still those ideas aren't the things that you take through to the final, but with a little bit of further refinement and testing, you can take all the good bits and lead onto something that feels different but is ultimately the right route for you. So I was excited to share this with you because I think it's nice to see it go through on a bit of a journey really, and it's working really well for the charity. It's a great campaign for them. It's something that they're still running with today. I'm going to hand it back over to Chris, I think, at this point. Oh, there we go. Just to show that we executed, and Chris mentioned this right at the beginning, that sometimes you have to think about different mediums that you might be rolling this out at. So we ran with videos as well. They produced some little video shorts and stuff. So we did stress test the idea to make sure it was going to work on different platforms in different ways, which was lovely. It gave them a much bigger asset bank when they actually rolled this out. Now I think I'm handing over to Chris. He's going to talk through a few more ideas and then we'll dive straight into questions.
Brilliant. Lovely, thanks Faith. Yeah, for those that have joined during the session, there's going to be plenty of time for questions. There's probably about another maybe 15-20 minutes of talking, and then we'll be happy to discuss things, take questions on the chat or not face to face, we'll Zoom to Zoom face anyway. But yeah, just a couple more examples really of projects that we've worked on that really hopefully illustrate how kind of creative ideas can help make something better and kind of come up with an interesting kind of approach to things. So this is not the work at this point, it's just to illustrate the problem really. So we're working with the University of Leeds and we were looking at sustainability. So really a lot to do with environment, but not just environment. It was also about kind of the wider impact they have in the community in Leeds and how to kind of bring that to life and communicate it in an interesting way. And the challenge with sustainability and environment is that often it's communicated in quite kind of cliched ways really, in ways that people have seen so many different times before, that it kind of loses its appeal and impact and it just becomes, you know, just sort of background sort of noise really. So they were interested in doing something different and something new, and they had the added layer really with sustainability that it's quite difficult to sort of photograph. So a lot of the things that they do are kind of quite abstract, or they might be, for instance, it might be like some kind of heat compressor in a grey box in the back of a university room. It's not going to make a great powerful photograph, even though that box is doing a great deal in terms of reducing the carbon emissions of the university. It's not something that you can necessarily kind of get excited about in a visual way. So it was trying to kind of think around how to come up with something different for them. And they're also, you know, reasonably competitive, as many universities and organisations are. So they were interested to look at kind of, well, you know, what are other universities doing? How can we do something that stands out amongst their peers as well? So we ended up coming up with developing a suite of illustrations. I'll show you this in a bit more context shortly. And this came directly from, I talked about the research earlier, the importance of looking around at what other people are doing and inspired by that. And there was a particular illustrator called Noma Bar, who is very, very world famous actually for kind of looking at developing illustrations that have kind of two meanings or have two things within them. And so that work, when we showed the people we were working with, really kind of stood out to them as being quite exciting and quite original and quite different. And so we took that idea of kind of two in one, like can we communicate two things in one illustration, or get people to think a little bit deeper about it. And so that was where we kind of come up with this idea of combining the two elements. So in this case, it's kind of the idea of a tree, but also being a brain. So the idea of thinking about sustainability and embedding it within the organisation, and also training people up to be more aware about things like climate change and environmental performance. So what we then developed is a suite of things for the university that all had this kind of idea of two in one. How can we combine two things? Not easy, I'll be honest. It was one of we're proud of the work, but actually we create ourselves quite a challenge, because actually within that concept, it was a tough thing sometimes to kind of think, well, this particular part of the work, how on earth are we going to illustrate that? So even if you come up with a good idea, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easy to execute. But I think where this worked is it meant that it could liberate them from the need to photograph things that weren't very visual. It did have that kind of, it had an intelligence element to it, because they wanted people to think a little bit harder. They didn't necessarily want it to be super immediate in the same way as like an advert has to be on a billboard or on a television, where, you know, you don't want to risk people being confused by it. They were quite happy to kind of challenge a little bit and say to people, we'll have a little, you know, explore this a bit more deeply. And they also wanted as well to bring in the city of Leeds. So you see the one on the left here. This was a kind of direct challenge of like, what this is about people, it's about the city. We're kind of like people and the city, and we need to get two ideas in one, and it needs to combine different elements. So you can see how it developed, but it sometimes it was quite a challenge, but it was also very distinctive. And so they were pleased in terms of that actually it had that resonance that made people kind of go, oh, that's Leeds, that looks different. That's the people who use that illustration style. And you can see some more examples there. So that was Leeds. And, you know, I think often it's a case of, and it might be the same for you, that you are in quite a competitive environment, or there's lots of people saying the same things. And so it's trying to how to kind of single out something and make it different. This next campaign for the YMCA is super new. I think it was launched maybe yesterday, I think, and it's going to be rolled out next week. And this was a small project actually, but we went through the same sort of creative lab process. I can't show you all the other iterations actually for this one, but we had a session where we gathered together information from other campaigns, which I showed you earlier on. We then ran a creative lab sort of exercise where we looked at what different ways of expressing it, and it was all around mental health, but particularly around conversation. So getting people to talk openly about mental health and actually finding the time just to kind of break through and kind of have a conversation. And so we did that exercise. We looked at the brief, we looked at what other people have been doing, we fine-tuned it. And this one had lots of constraints. And obviously, as Faith mentioned earlier, you don't want to bring the constraints in too early, but later on we had to bring in the constraints, and that had to be something that could be delivered very, very quickly. So it had to be worked up in basically 2 days. And also it had to be something that YMCA, because of its structure, each YMCA could kind of use and adapt in their own kind of way. So it had to have that sort of simplicity to it. And in terms of the campaign name, it was Small Talks, Big Difference. It was the idea that actually having a conversation, simple thing like talking, which most of us can do, then it can actually contribute and make a big difference. This sort of geometric shape linked in with the wider brand for the YMCA. And in essence, this was the campaign. So really quite simple. And it was this idea of, we use the idea of breaking through silence. So this idea that people are sitting there and thinking, I really should talk to that person because I can tell they're not doing so well, but something's holding me back. And so it's really about supporting each other, colleagues and volunteers at the YMCA and the staff really. So this idea of this police tape, and then the police tape being removed, if you like, not police tape, but it looks like police tape, the idea of removing the silence and then having a conversation. And so it was using all sorts of different formats, really simple idea. But again, we looked at what other people were doing and made sure it stood out and was different to what other people were doing. And it also needs to translate into lots of different things. So Faith mentioned again, what's the format. So we knew this had to work on a t-shirt, on an email signature, on the website, all kinds of different things. And I hope this might work. Oh yeah. So a little animated version as well. So the idea of the tape being removed. So we wanted to think about how it could work as an animated sequence as well. So I think the thing here is as I say, it's not really necessarily about animation. It's about once you've got that core idea, it can then be worked across all the different platforms that you might need it to do. So usually a core strong idea can work for a TV ad, radio, an email campaign, a poster. You can usually see it will translate across if the idea is strong. So that was YMCA. The next one is a campaign that we worked on, and some of you may well be from this network. So thank you for your contributions if you contributed to this. So this was a campaign that we worked on for London Libraries, working with Libraries Connected as well. And our challenge was to come up with a way of marketing library services in the London area, and particularly trying to encourage people to come back into the library after COVID and to kind of experience physically the real experience of libraries when people may have fallen out of the habit of doing that and be feeling more comfortable about accessing services remotely or online. And it was also trying to kind of target particular, I suppose, harder to reach groups in the sense of libraries audiences. So it's kind of adult working age mainly that the focus of the campaign was for. So I'm going to show you just briefly some of the ideas in development. And again, some of you may well have seen this. So we ran the same process that Faith has talked you through. So a creative lab process where we explored different ideas, did a long list, did a short list, and then worked some of them up. So I won't go too far in detail in terms of the rough ideas, but we were looking at this. This is sort of shows you some of that work, so you can understand the sort of journey that we went through, if you like. So we were looking at potentially a very environmentally focused campaign that was talking about the benefits of borrowing and what the carbon environmental savings might be for that. So we explored some different ideas around this. This wasn't right for various reasons. The kind of not encouraging people to buy wasn't the right message, but this is an exploratory phase, so that's why we developed some different ideas to kind of explore. We had this idea around people and what the benefits were to them as individuals. What can actually library services deliver beyond books, or as well as books actually? So this was much more about kind of the personal benefits and the diversity of those personal benefits to people. So what would people discover at the library? What would it deliver for them as an individual? So that was one of the ideas that we explored as well. And then this other idea was around actually people seem to be quite keen on book clubs, and in a way the library is the biggest book club we've got going. So it was this idea of actually we've got so many books available in the London area, so many different reasons to visit. Let's kind of present this, position it as one giant book club that you could join by becoming a member of your library. So they were some of the ideas that we kind of worked up for this. And I think what's interesting, you'll see very directly here, is that what came out of it was a bit of a combination of two of the ideas. So it wasn't a case of the network felt, right, yes, that's the one, but there were ingredients within it that people really, really liked. And I think this can often happen where people kind of say, well, look, I really love where you've used that photography over there. That's just so feels right for me, but I really don't like that line, that copy line. It just doesn't work. So can you, but we love that copy line. Is there any way of bringing it together? Now, sometimes that doesn't work, I'll warn you. Sometimes it's a bit like a recipe where if you sort of have half a recipe from one pie and half a recipe from a casserole, you stick it together, it could be a right mess. But sometimes it does, or there's a way of kind of blending things together to make it work. So just a word of warning, sometimes you can't chop and change and get a great result, but sometimes you can. So in this case, this is now live. So the name of the campaign became At the Library, and we had this supporting line, Discover the Power of Libraries for Yourself. And what you might realise here is there's a bit of a blend. So what seemed to work really well was this idea of the personal benefit, the personal experience, and the benefits that can come from the library. So I found a new career I love, I discovered my new passion, I found a new creative space. So those ideas of attaching the wider benefits of libraries to individuals really worked, but they didn't like we didn't feel like the way that it was visually executed in the draft state worked. They really loved the colours of another idea. So it was an amalgamation of two ideas to come up with the winning formula here. So these are presented here as posters. The idea again, once the idea was formed, It's been reworked for use on sort of social media in various formats. Another important thing here was the flexibility to bring in different messages. So that it was hard to find one single thing that would work throughout the entire campaign. So the idea is it's quite flexibility, so we can appeal to different people's state of mind or their different kind of aspirations. So some people will be looking potentially for a new place to work outside of their home, and that those sorts of messages would work. Other people, it might be all about the books, and that's okay. So the idea with this campaign, one of the requirements was that kind of flexibility that could span across different sort of ideas around and attach that to different types of people. And also then it has the flexibility in the future that you could change some of the messaging to appeal to a particular moment in time as well. So it has that kind of ongoing flexibility to tie it in with potentially other campaigns and awareness weeks that might be running. And also with this one, it was also about developing a bit of a toolkit. So this campaign needed a toolkit that people could then use the different assets in their own way within their own library service. So it wasn't just about coming from one source. And it was also linked in with, we had to find a really strong call to action. And one of the ways to execute that was actually saying to people, look, if you sign up and you show your interest, we'll send you this 100 must-read novels list. So that one of the things that came out of it was the fact that actually, if you give your audience something in return for them giving you something, that reciprocal exchange of value may encourage people to participate in the campaign. So we will hopefully see that. And if you want to take part, you can go to atthelibrary.net, sign up for this list, and then you can be part of it. So have a look at the website is now live if you'd like to have a look at kind of where this campaign ended up. So that really is the end, pretty much the end of the kind of formal presentation part of it. Just a few kind of key takeaways really. First one is start with your research. We've mentioned it a few times, but it doesn't have to be, research always makes it feel like it's going to take, you know, weeks. It's really onerous. You know, give yourself an hour. An hour is amazing. When you're focused on one particular thing, you're thinking, right, I want to find some brilliant campaigns about X or some brilliant examples of communications around this particular topic. It's amazing what you can find in an hour. And we shared a particular blog reference that might be able to help you do that. So yeah, make sure you start with research, because you know, it will save so much time. An hour investment will save a lot of time. The next one is, again, everyone can be creative. So don't think, oh, I'm not a creative person. There is actually not such a thing. People have different ways of thinking about creativity and different ways of expressing that. But certainly everyone can contribute to things, contribute to that process, and actually drawing on wider perspectives and opinions almost always means the end result is better. And, you know, I think connected to that, there are no stupid questions. We always say that in the creative labs, you know, ask the questions now, because if not, someone will ask them later on, and we won't have addressed it. So, you know, ask questions, throw in ideas, no stupid ones, it's all good. And value the creative process. It's part of what makes a project a success. It does make a difference to the outcome. If not, you know, it wouldn't be worth doing. We will be spending the time with you today. So it changes the results, it changes the impact you can have, it changes the destinies of organisations and brands and people in society. It's worth doing. And make it fun and comfortable for everyone to share ideas. You know, we've talked about that a lot, but I think, you know, it should be an enjoyable process. Not everything we do at work is always going to be enjoyable, but this bit of it, I firmly believe, is enjoyable and should be something that people kind of get involved and engage with at the right time and really enjoy. And we can talk maybe about tools, about how to kind of encourage people to what's the best way to share ideas. Maybe in some of the discussion we can get into that. And yeah, build on each other's ideas. That's one thing. Face it, I'll say it again, but building on each other's ideas. It's very rare that someone has an idea session and says, I've got it. This is the image. This is the headline. This is what it's going to look like. That's my idea. And it goes through. I mean, I think that's maybe happened once in 20 years, because the chances are people have a kind of a rough idea and they've got a sense of what they want to express. But if you share it with someone else, they'll say, I see what you mean. Why don't you do this? Why have you thought about that? And it gets better and better and better. So you're building on each other's ideas. And also don't be precious. It's not about saying, I want my idea to be the winner, because it's not really about that. Because if you're part of the process, your idea is the winner, because what comes out of it is a collaborative idea that is the thing that flies. And so it's not about yours as an individual, it's about yours as a creative team, really. And that is, in a nutshell, kind of presentation and want to share with you in terms of those techniques, but very, very happy to take some questions. And I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen. In the rehearsal slightly earlier, I couldn't get out of sharing my screen once I started sharing it. So if I'm bashing about here, oh no, it worked first time that time. So there you go. That's fine. Phew, that's good. So yeah, it looks like I've only been able to see the chat now, because when you're screen sharing, for some reason I can't get to the chat. So I can see there are messages in the chat which I can open up, and so people by all means contribute questions in there, or we can open it. People can raise their hand in a kind of reactions way.
There's one question, Chris, in the chat that we could kick off with from Hayley. So I'll read that out for everybody. I'm sure you can all see it. But for the London Libraries campaign, are they stock images or did you commission some photography? We're really keen to show real people in real libraries, but wondered in your experience whether this is something that's important to customers.
Excellent question. They are stock images, and the reason for that really, it's two reasons really. One, time, two, budget. And also because it was such a breadth of different libraries that we were working with, it wasn't practical as well in order to sort of represent it in a very literal way. So obviously you saw Faith's presentation around Barts. They were obviously real staff in situ in the hospital, very authentic and real. But for the London's one, they weren't. It was more about expressing the idea and being able to get the right tone of photography at the speed and cost that we needed.
Just to add into that, actually, because this is a real life challenge, isn't it? Of can you commission photography? Is it practical? Is it within the budget? And we hit that all the time. And I don't think there's a right or wrong approach, to be honest. But there are a few kind of rules or guides that I try and keep in my mind. So the reason that the Barts example, for example, were real people and that they invested in that photography was because they were attributed to quotes as well. So don't try and pretend that somebody in a stock photo is somebody real or someone from your community or what have you. I think the way that the Libraries campaign manages it, because it's quite broad and it's general, it's almost conceptual quotes rather than it being attributed, it works effectively, but try not to kind of fake it, because stock photography does pop up in other places, and we've seen our stock photography pop up in other places from time to time. So it's just something to be mindful of. And then the other thing is getting under your belt a couple of places where you can get good quality UK based stock photography. So a lot of our clients work on social campaigns or social issues, and there are a couple of places, and I don't have them to hand, but I'm happy to share them out after this session via the team at Libraries Connected. Some stock photography libraries that have a much more authentic kind of UK based social issues feel. They look like real people. So it pays to invest a little bit more in terms of the stock photography that you're looking for, and we do always try to do that, to try and find something that feels certainly UK based or of close to the area that we're developing, because that's a real giveaway and something that has a bit more of an authenticity to it.
Brilliant. Great, we've got some more questions now, which is brilliant. We'll try and cover as many of these as we can. We've got a question from Amy about how would you go about coming up, I think, for ideas for smaller campaigns when you're part of a very, very small team or working on your own. Is a very good question. So I suppose, you know, it depends on, in terms of scale of team, I guess we actually think that sometimes you can have too big a group as well. So actually being a small team isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, in advertising land, people tend to have work just as a pair. So they'll have like somebody who's focused on the copywriting and somebody who's kind of an art director, and they work as a duo. And what you find in big ad agencies is that duo, you know, when one person leaves, they leave together. They go as a pair and they travel around, and they're kind of like a creative unit. So it just illustrates that actually two people can very effectively operate and come up with creative ideas. We tend to like to work with a slightly wider team than that, just because I think it's richer because you get more input. But you know, sometimes it can be small, and certainly I've run sessions with Faith where there might be 3 of us, for example, and it's very effective. I think the other thing is thinking about whose opinion you trust. So it might not be necessarily that it's somebody that you work with. So it might be somebody that you want to bounce ideas around. So this is a bit of a simple example, but we've been working on a campaign aimed at young people. And I am no longer a young person. So I didn't think that necessarily getting more people of my age, you know, in a room to kind of bounce ideas around was going to be that productive. So, you know, I tapped into my own children and their friends in terms of like, can you give us an opinion about this? Do you think this would work? You know, what have you seen something like this before? So it doesn't necessarily always have to be the person that you're sitting with in an office or going to be in a team meeting with, and particularly if that you don't have a team, but it might be it's kind of a peer, a friend, a family member who you trust, and it can be quite informal. So although we've outlined a process, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be done in a formal setting. It can be done in an informal setting. So if you've got anything to add on that one, Faith.
Yeah, the only thing, Amy, that I'd add on that in terms of working on your own is that's, for me personally, where this idea of spreading it out over a number of different days or having breaks in between becomes even more important. Because I think if you're working up ideas on your own, or you're really kind of putting pressure on yourself to try and generate the best idea, it can be too intense to sort of sit there for 2 hours with your notepad and your pencil. You only get the self that is at that moment there. So when I'm tackling stuff on my own, and it is on me to do, as I'm imagining many of you will be in that position, I will do what I was talking about earlier on. I'll still do a bit of a brief basher. I'll still kind of challenge myself to do the one-liner, but I might do that on Monday. I might on Tuesday, I might have a look at some inspiration and see if I can come up with a couple of ideas from that. Later on that day, after I've done something else, I might take one of the other activities through and try some of those prompts on my own. I think when you're working on your own, it's even more important to break it up into chunks, because it's that stepping away that allows you to almost bring different perspectives to it. Even though they're all your own, you're kind of still being influenced externally from what else you're doing. So I would say that that's a practical tip that I use and that works for me and might do for yourself.
Brilliant. Thanks, Faith. I've just got another question around accessibility from Naomi. So it's tips around images and accessibility. We're mindful of keeping it simple, and we're getting better at adding alt text to images, but I just wonder how important thinking about this at the start of creating campaigns is, and if you have any tips. Again, good question. I mean, we work a lot on accessibility, particularly on, well, actually mainly online, just because a lot of the online and digital is happening at the moment. And it's a big topic. I mean, I think there's a few things to do there. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that the formation of an idea, I would say, bring it in later. Not that you're not thinking about it, but that actually, if you are dividing the campaign around that, I think it could be something that may confuse things at the beginning. I think it's a thing that accessibility is something that all comms needs to address. We don't tend to think about it right. We think about it throughout rather than think about it shaping the idea. I think in terms of images, you know, there's two elements to it. If they are part of articulating the idea in terms of the content, then obviously they need to be not just alt text, but also a good, clear description about what the idea is to help it. Sometimes visual material is used purely decoratively, and so it's a slightly different thing in terms of it being used online. So, but yeah, alt text, thinking about which images are there to drive the content and therefore need describing, articulating clearly, and which are there as decorative, I think is an important element, because sometimes they are used decoratively. I don't know if there's any other tips that you've come across, Faith.
Not specifically on that, no. I think that's good.
But anyone got any other thoughts on that? By all means, add them to the text. I mean, you know, you can obviously, if it's online, you can get free sort of screen readers to check how your campaign or how your creative performs in that environment. So that is something that you can do and would recommend. And most operating systems have a free version of that, so you can check for screen reader compatibility. just have a look at the questions.
There's another one here, which is something that I think we probably all deal with, which is about how to come up with new approaches when you're doing annual campaigns, when things have been done before, like Halloween or Christmas or International Week of or Day of or what have you. Both Chris and I, before we were at Creative Concern, worked in-house in organisations, and so we really understand that circular kind of the calendar of events that come around and the pressure that is on you annually to come up with something fresh and different. And it is a challenge. I think there are some tips though that have helped in the past, certainly me and my teams, and might help you. I think the first one actually is to kind of remember that an important part of any rollout of comms is to do a little bit of evaluation and checking in on how it went at the end. So even if you can ask people questions at the end of a campaign or check in with them, find out what stuck with them, what they remembered, what they liked, what they took away from the campaign, getting into a habit, even if it's just a post or two on your social channels that follows up a period of activity, simple surveying, something like that. Quite often you can get some tips that feed into the following year's activity from that. And failing that, kind of asking some questions. So again, we sometimes do use social media platforms on the lead up to campaign development to start to broach bigger subjects and ask people what matters to them and what issues they're interested in. So Facebook's really good for that because you can do quite lengthy comments and you can reach out to people. So if, for example, we're working on a National Tree Week thing at the moment for an organisation. So before we dive into the creative on that, we're kind of asking over the social channels of the charity that we're supporting, what would you like to hear? What do you love about trees? What's interesting? How do trees impact your life? What's the difference that they make? Sometimes quite broad questions, but can just spark off a little bit of a different direction for you. It can suddenly make you think, oh, this one maybe could be all focused around volunteering opportunities, or it could be all focused around kind of the people of, or the faces behind, or, you know, the key moments in history, or whatever it is. So try and broaden out your research on that to sort of get as much insight as you can. And then, of course, as Chris said, kind of dipping into inspiration and research from other places to see what they're doing. All the best creatives borrow. It's definitely something that is done and can be done really well to increase your kind of inspiration there. Chris, I don't know whether you've got any other thoughts from working at organisations where there's a stuff.
I mean, I quite like the challenge of kind of revisiting the same thing. So I started out, not started out actually, but I spent some time working for the Vegetarian Society. So we had National Vegetarian Week, and it came around, and it came around again, and it came around again. And, you know, on the one hand, it's kind of the same thing each year. So I really like the idea of kind of going, right, same thing, what are we going to do this time? And what can we focus on this time? I actually think it's a bit of a gift, because I think it means you can kind of build on it, make it better. You just have to try. I mean, I think, you know, I always think, imagine if you were marketing director for Domestos, or, you know, your product you were marketing was the toilet duck, you know. Now, it's quite hard to get inspired about these things personally. No offense to anybody from those places, but so I think when you're in the public sector, you've got really rich sort of subject matter to go at. So I think actually we're incredibly lucky to be able to kind of focus on marketing such brilliant things. So yeah, I think it's okay, and I think it's a good challenge. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's, again, start it as if you would any other challenge. You kind of go, right, say the Halloween example, right, let's have a look. What's the best Halloween campaigns that have been done connected to my world? You know, what can we do? What can we do differently? How can we surprise people? And see it as a bit of a, okay, it's tough because we've done this a few times, but I actually think it means you can really try for something quite dramatically different. And also because, you know, Halloween and Christmas are examples from Gina there. They're already known. You've already got a kind of language and a visual aesthetic, shortcuts to them. It means it can push you to come up with really interesting things. So I'd just say, embrace it as a challenge. You know it's going to come around each year, and sort of try and enjoy it, really. Great one as well to get the team involved in, I think, because it should be a really enjoyable thing, that.
So we've got a good practical question from Joshua, just about how much time on average you'd allow to run a creative ideas session, 2 hours or half a day or a whole day. So that's varied, but our experience, I think creative lab sessions, if you're doing them all in one go and you're running through some of the activities like we have, and those ideas are coming through, and then you're doing all the bits and bobs to grow them, usually a couple of hours maximum will nail it, and that allows for a little bit of a break as well. There's a few reasons why pitching it at that point is quite helpful. It makes it much more appealing to get more people involved, and as we said at the beginning, the key thing really is to try and get a diverse range of people around the table. Even if they're not on your team, you want to try and get them involved, and it feels like an hour and a half to 2 hours feels like a reasonable ask quite often. And also it means, because a lot of what we focus on with that is speed. If things are dragged out over a much longer period of time, it allows people to have the comfort of talking and going into things in much more detail, and you can lose your way. You can either go down a rabbit hole and end up really, really over laboring an idea, or literally losing focus on what you're trying to do. So with these idea sessions, try and aim for speed and try and go through it quick. And whoever it is that's chairing them or leading them needs an eye on that, really. I meant it when I said I do set the timer on my phone, and we have alarms going off in 30 seconds or 2 minutes. We set quite tight timeframes around these to force people to act and to contribute and to think, and also so that there's a bit of energy, because I think sometimes if they run over longer periods, they lose some energy and drive, and people don't come out of them feeling buzzy, they come out feeling drained, which isn't great. The only exception to that, as I say, is sometimes when you're doing things remotely, or you can't get the commitment of a kind of workshop period with people, stretch them out over a number of days. Say, look, I'm going to need a couple of hours up from you over the space of this week, but each day I'm going to send you a different challenge, and we're going to have a 30-minute Zoom chat, but I'm also going to send you a quick survey and a couple of questions. I'm going to be texting you, and I'll be wanting you to text back an idea, or, you know, so you can do it in that way. You can spread it out and try and dip into people's availability in a slightly different way, and that comes up with a slightly different kind of approach, but it can be helpful. But kind of aim for speed, aim to keep it tight and keep the energy up.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because I think the other thing is that people can get lost and caught on one idea and just keep going on that idea. So, you know, I think that's the thing. People can kind of like, people can talk for 25 minutes on one idea once they've got it in their head. So I think that the role of the chair is to kind of sort of say, right, we've got that, written it down, that's fine, let's move on. It's not disregarding it, it's the opposite, saying we've captured that, we'll come back to it, let's get some more ideas going. So yeah, it is about that energy, really, because as we know, you know, in terms of meetings, you can talk about one thing for a 2-hour meeting if it's allowed to happen. So I think it is trying to kind of keep a good roll on it. It just makes it more fun for everybody as well.
Yeah, there's a really good question that a couple of people have focused in on as well from Lavinia, which is about how it's often easy to lose focus on key message because there's so much good stuff going on. There is so much you can literally tie into, so many national campaigns to join in with and many creative minds involved. How would you focus that down in order to have the biggest impact on the target audience? So I'm sure Chris is going to have some thoughts on that. My first thoughts on that are come back down really to a sort of version of that brief basher that I was talking about, but maybe for your entire service. Because if you can, at the start of the year or when you're doing your planning, go through a bit of a process, and you will all be doing this, no doubt, of having some comms planning and probably have a few sheets of paper detail and so on, but try and boil that down to a kind of essence of what you are trying to communicate this year, what the focus for you guys is this year, and make that quite succinct so that it's in your head and you know that that is the target. It gives you something then to compare all these outside influences against. You can start to look at, you know, well, will a big focus on Dyslexia Week, will that help us achieve what it is that we said this year we were going to really focus on? Will focusing on Black History Month do that? Or is that something that would be amazing to do and we could do, but it wouldn't actually help us achieve the ultimate goal? It might be a kind of strategic goal for your service that you do that links in with your comms planning. Another way of doing that is actually getting a lot more familiar with who your target audiences are. And this may be a bit involved, but it doesn't always have to be. We do what we call kind of audience personas for some of our clients. So we map out sometimes not a huge number, maybe 3 or 4 key personas of the audiences that they are trying to reach. And we try and make those personas as rich as possible. We try and work out who they are, where they live, what they're interested in, what influences them, what media they're reaching, everything we can possibly either find out through research or just intuit to know what is it that we know about those people. If you have those audience personas in mind, again, they're useful when ideas come in or suggestions are made to go, right, would that reach our key audiences? And we give them names, you know, would that reach Barry, Joan and Jeff, or whoever it is? Would that speak to them? Would that help reach them and affect change in the way that we wanted to with those guys? So having something to kind of compare and contrast everything that's external against, and help you make some of those judgment calls, really helps, really helps. And being a little bit brutal as well, knowing that your resources are limited. And it is that classic thing, isn't it, that if you say yes all the time, really you're probably saying no in truth to something that's more important. So having some justifications in that and being able to be very clear on your purpose and focus and who it is that you're trying to reach might help that.
I agree with that. I think the other thing is it's about maintaining your voice within all of this. So I think that's super important, like who you are and what you stand for, not you as an individual person, it might be you, but more likely to be for your organisation or service. And so that when you're taking part in wider things, it needs to be communicated through the lens of who you are, not necessarily just about amplifying other initiatives. It's not that there's anything wrong with that. So I'm just trying to think of a good example. So we recently made a film for International Women's Day for a particular organisation, and the content that we put together for them was, yes, it was relevant to that day, but it was definitely through the lens of what is their contribution and what's their voice within it, rather than just saying it's this day, isn't it good? Here's some stuff. You know, because I think sometimes that doesn't really connect with an audience. It feels a little bit like people are just piggybacking on a thing, because there's so many great initiatives and weeks and awareness days and so on. It can end up looking a bit scattergun and it doesn't ultimately build, you know, in marketing speak, doesn't build your brand and your voice. And ultimately you need to do that in order to be more effective. So it's kind of trying to think about so if you're contributing to Black History Month, what is it that you can contribute to that? What can you say about that, rather than just saying it is this and it is good? I would try and find your role within it, and I think then it doesn't feel so scattergun. It feels like more of a coherent, not necessarily campaign, coherent piece of communications throughout the year. Great.
Lots more questions. I'm just. So we've got a question here from Lucy about how much time you would allow for an entire campaign from initial planning to launch. So that's a good question. They're really pertinent to us. How long would we normally expect to have to plan a campaign from those early ideas through to it being ready? That is very varied, of course. The answer is going to be, it depends on the scale of the campaign, and it depends on how it needs to execute, and other practical things like whether there is budget for testing, and so on and so forth. I think, you know, usually from a creative agency perspective, we'd look at a month being a realistic kind of turnaround time from ideas to kind of early working up and getting the final assets ready as a minimum. And we have worked quicker than that, but I think having enough time to build in some of those core milestones in the planning of the campaign is really important. So yes, you can go quick, but it helps, I think, to know that at least a month's worth of time, and that's if you've got some dedicated resource there to be able to go through the creative ideas and the bit before that, which is obviously the research and the developing the brief and so on, and then give yourself a bit of breathing space, a little bit of time to test any ideas that come out before you go into the final launch can be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that.
A super practical question here is about the strapline for at the library. Can it be used, or is it your copyright?
I think, I mean, it's very hard to copyright particular phrases. I mean, obviously you can do it, but I wouldn't have said that this is copyrighted at this point. But I'd probably say to ask libraries connected directly rather than us to, just out of courtesy. I imagine they'll be pleased that people are taking it on board and amplifying things. I think that's fine. Obviously, copyright is, we have a variety of copyright challenges over the years of running the agency, in terms of trying to make sure that what you're coming up with hasn't been used, hasn't been copyrighted by somebody else, isn't owned. So it's a challenge. I wouldn't want to give copywriting advice on this call. I would say that there is some good free advice available online, and it's worth looking into. On most occasions, particularly if it's for something that is not for profit, which most of your world will be in, it's slightly simpler to use things, but I would always check, and it's not down for me to give you legal advice. I wouldn't take it from myself.
Mm-hmm. But Libraries Connected, definitely the people about the specific creative, and rather than ourselves, it's the clients certainly that own that. So get in touch with those guys if that's something that you'd like to progress. There's a question. You might be going for the same one, Chris. Go on.
About buy-in. Any top tips to kind of get people signed up and supporting the campaign? Really great question, something that we're involved in on a daily basis, really. And I think one of the reasons that we developed the kind of Creative Lab idea was to help with that. So that if you broaden out the number of people who are involved in the development of ideas, it does make it simpler when you're trying to then get that buy-in and support. And I also think that the other thing to do is to communicate as early as you possibly can with people, to let them know that something is coming down the tracks. So there's some kind of buy-in in terms of, are people comfortable with the idea and know it's happening? And I think so on that side, if you can involve them in the creative process, even if they can't be in all the sessions, they know what's going on. That's great, because it kind of builds an alliance. People start to go, oh yeah, I've heard about this campaign coming down the tracks, so I've heard about this initiative. That's good. So when it actually does land with them, it's not a big surprise. So that's one top tip there. And I think the other thing, in terms of encouraging people to either sign up, support it, or use it, if you like, whatever it is, I think the critical thing on that is make it as simple as you possibly can to get involved, because I've seen a lot of this, particularly recently, when people have done all kinds of elaborate kind of toolkits to engage and guidance for getting engaged. And sometimes, you know, the guidance document is like 50 pages long, and I kind of think, you know, that's going to fail, I'm afraid, at the first hurdle there, because you've been so restrictive and so prescriptive that I'd worry that people haven't got the time to engage with it. You know, one thing is for sure, we're all time starved, most of us anyway, and that particularly if someone's asking us to get involved in something else, it has to be incredibly simple and for us to do, and flexible for us to do, and not to be overly restrictive. If there are real definite restrictions and rules, keep them slight, bring them to the top. Don't expect someone to read your extensive guidance note, just because people aren't going to do it. It's the practicality of it, really. So keep it practical, simple and short.
And then there's a question from Graziano, which talks about campaigns that have a very specific target audience in mind, whether that's enterprises or schools or colleagues, and what kind of approach and tools that we'd use on there. Well, we do run a lot of communications and campaigns that are very targeted to a specific audience, although those audiences in our time have been very broad. I think the starting point for that is to not automatically default to a model that you always use, because sometimes organizations, and it's done for really good reasons, it's done because it's quick and it's simple and it's cost effective, have their ways of doing things. They always roll out using posters in X, Y, and Z. There's some Facebook posts, some stuff on the website, and that's what they do. I think if you are targeting a very specific audience, you have to start with understanding that audience and where they are, first of all, and what it is that they are looking for from you and how it is that they're likely to want to engage. So it comes a little bit back to those audience personas, to really understanding the people that you're reaching, because no surprise, if you are trying to reach an audience that aren't in the places where your normal outreach work would be, you're not going to be successful there. And that can sometimes be a bit of legwork. It can sometimes need a bit of research. It can mean picking up the phone and trying to find out where people are and where they get their information from, or talking to other organisations that you know and trust, or colleagues who've reached those audiences in similar ways. But starting with a much cleaner sheet can sometimes be helpful there, and it gives you the ability to build up a campaign and some tools that meet the needs of that specific audience, for sure. And the other caution there, really, and we have to kind of remind ourselves of this as well, is that digital comms is super, super powerful and everywhere, and it's really accessible, and often it's a very cheap way of rolling comms out. And it can also be fantastic because you can target brilliantly if you're doing any paid for activity. So it can allow you to target really, really closely in. So definitely explore your opportunities in terms of digital communications, and social media in particular, being able to run some advertising maybe on there and really target down into certain groups can be a great way to get in front of people. But don't let digital be so all-consuming that you forget that there's other means of engaging with people. It's a very different world to the one you guys are in at the moment, but I'm working with an organisation at the moment who are trying to reach farmers and landowners. And whilst you can target them digitally, and whilst we've got lots of resource to be able to reach them through digital channels, we also know that that isn't necessarily the approach that works the best with that audience, and that some of the things that feel maybe a little bit old-fashioned to us, or that feel a little bit lo-fi and that we're not sure we'd normally be recommending, like flyers and posters or banner stands at key events and things, are actually spot on for that audience. And we only learned that from talking to people and finding out and actually doing a little bit of that research. So use digital for its targeting capabilities. It is mind-blowing what some of the main platforms can do in terms of targeting now, with a really small amount of investment on the paid for. But also remember that there's a whole wealth of other ways that you can reach out to people.
Definitely. I think it's about thinking about when you engage and talk to those audiences to get their feedback, isn't it? So, I mean, we've just developed a climate change campaign very recently, launched last week, aimed at 18 to 24-year-olds. And, we spoke to the group of 18 to 24-year-olds very, very early on in that process, because we actually realised that in order to get this right, there was kind of no point getting too far down in terms of kind of the creative expression before we took the temperature of what they were thinking. And I'm so pleased that we did that, because we were way off mark. Now, we've been working on climate change communications for about 15, 16 years, and I kind of thought I knew what I was doing. But actually, because they're such a different demographic to myself, and they're not an audience that I talk to specifically about climate change for a long time, their state of mind compared to what we thought as 40 pluses was very, very marked and very, very different. And so I think, that was an investment of 2 online focus groups with about 12, 15 people on each. It was an incredibly good investment of time, because it totally changed our emphasis. And it meant then when you went into the creative side of things, more creative ideas side, you had that insight, and it really, really shaped things. So, it's also being frank with yourself around, can I make the right judgments about this? Do I need to bring in that external perspective, and getting that at the right time, because then it can have an impact and change what you're going to do.
I've just seen the question from Michelle, actually, which is a specific but a really good question. And yeah, in different ways, I'm sure people have come across these kind of tricky partnership questions before. So just to read out, a funeral home is happy to give us money for events at the library. One was for children around Father's Day. The only ask is to promote them on our posters and leaflet, but that is proving really difficult and staff feel uneasy about it. Any ideas as how to promote them without being morbid? Yeah, for sure. So this is one where where kind of a bit of creative thinking around that partnership could be really valuable. I think the first thing that I'd be doing in this situation is talking to the organisation, the funeral home, about what it is that they're wanting out of the relationship with you, because it may very well be that they don't want, or it's not realistic to expect them to have their logo on all your promotional materials. Even if they're giving you money that's being spent on a child's event, it doesn't necessarily mean that their logo has to be attached to that event. And you have the power to be able to say that as well, because it has to work for your brand as much as it does for them. And I would say in that instance, kind of branding a children's event with the funders logo in that way, with it being the subject matter that it is, wouldn't be appropriate. That doesn't mean that they don't get anything from that and they have to walk away with their money, and that the relationship has to break down. So I'd be having a conversation with them about what it is that they actually want to achieve from the relationship with you. And it might be that you can offer them some stuff that feels more appropriate to them and would help them reach their objectives and reach the audiences that they're trying to reach, but that also feels like it will fit with your brand and fit appropriately with the people that you're trying to reach and what you're trying to do. So, for example, yes, their money might be used for some events that you run with children and families, but maybe in return you could be offering to run kind of some sessions within the library where people come and there's an expert talking about healthy kind of attitudes towards death and how to support people, or kind of, you know, some thought-provoking content or pieces around that maybe. And that is where the brand of the funeral home might become more relevant, and you can kind of introduce them. Exactly, death positive stuff is really relevant at the moment and really interesting. So I think it's probably about not feeling that you have to have a particular approach whenever you're given some support, and that logo has to go on everything regardless, but actually entering into a conversation about what's appropriate and what you can give back to those funders that will help them achieve what they're trying to achieve, without it starting to feel inappropriate, because I think your colleagues there are probably spot on in that, and it might start to actually damage your brand. And whether it's charities or organisations like yourself, there is always a risk when you're partnering up with funders or supporters that your brand could become damaged if it's not well managed. But of course, if it's managed in the right way, it can be fantastically beneficial. So I think organisations that look to support community organisations and so on are used to having those conversations, and it's one to have, and going in with some ideas, as I say, talks or thoughts around what they could do or what you could do together that would be a little bit more in keeping with your brand and theirs, might help just jump over that hurdle.
I think it's also probably about as well being honest with them that actually that those sorts of kind of logo or advert endorsements rarely actually work. You know, that actually sponsorship opportunities work when they're a bit more authentic and integrated with, and both organisations feel comfortable. They're much more likely to work than just adding a badge. And I think, you know, you can talk to them about that, about effectiveness as well as the fact that you don't feel comfortable about it. So I'm trying to think of an example. I haven't got a great example, but I'm just thinking about something we have dealt with, a sponsorship opportunity relatively recently, which was a sort of similar, you know, can you promote these products, you know, in a much more sort of literal way? But actually what we ended up doing was that it was more of a kind of, we had a film where somebody was using this piece of technology. It was a bit more product placement-y than an actual advert, but actually then it was much more enriching because they could talk about the benefits of this particular technology and what it delivered in terms of creativity and why it was interesting. And it was so much more valuable to them than just sticking their badge on the bottom of a leaflet for the event. You know, nobody would have cared, to be quite frank. They would have felt comfortable with it, but it wouldn't have had any impact in terms of people actually finding out anything about their service or product. But thinking about it in a slightly different way was actually better for them, more valuable to them, but they hadn't thought about it at the beginning. So it's trying to find that kind of authentic way of making sure it works for both brands, as Faith says. I do think it's possible. It is a challenge. It's not an easy one. It's not an easy conversation you want, so it's tough.
That is though where coming in with some ideas and some creative thoughts beforehand can be really beneficial. So maybe some of the thinking that we've done today might give you some roots, some ideas of what you could propose to them as a starting point. I think we might be through all the questions, Chris, certainly on the chat. So unless anybody has any additional questions or thoughts, I think we might have exhausted everybody, and people will definitely be ready for lunch, I think, after this.